Part 42. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 412. Li Tianlan looked ahead with a suspicious look on his face, obviously not finding anything. Tang Ning knew that someone was hiding there. It wasn't that he was more powerful than Li Tianlan and his senses were sharper. It was because from a moment ago, the epilepsy goo in his sleeve began to become restless, and the eye silkworm goo also began to move frequently. The identity of the person hiding in the dark who can cause the goo insects to behave like this is already very clear. There was no movement from that direction. Tang Ning looked over and asked, "The second prince is dead, what else do you want to do?" After he finished speaking for a long time, a man walked out from behind a tree more than 10 feet away. It was a figure wearing a bamboo hat. Judging from the figure, he should be a woman. The man took off the bamboo hat, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, "How did you find me, and how did you know it was me?" Under the cloak was a face that Tang Ning was not familiar with. The middle-aged woman's complexion was sallow, even a little dark, and something seemed to be smeared on her face. Although it was not the face of the middle-aged woman next to the second prince, she had indirectly touched her face just now. He admitted his identity. It seemed like he had gone through some disguise. As the only one among the second prince and others who had slipped through the net, her arrest warrants were all over the city. It would not be easy to escape from the city without changing her appearance. Tang Ning did not answer her question, but took 2 steps forward and said, "The second prince has been burned to ashes, why don't you give up?" The middle-aged woman said calmly, "I'm just a loser. If you die, you will die." This was not the first time that Tang Ning experienced the viciousness of this woman. Her apprentice left her behind as soon as he was told, and the master who followed him died. In the blink of an eye, she turned against her and became merciless. This woman was more poisonous than the poison she raised. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "You are also a Han, why do you do things for them? You are too lenient." The middle-aged woman said coldly, walked slowly towards the side, looked at Li Tianlan, and said calmly, "Unexpectedly, the majestic princess of the Chu kingdom would actually lower herself to fall in love with a humble official in the Chen kingdom. Love has no distinction between status. Princes will fall in love with Cinderella. Why can't princesses like poor boys? What's more, he is not poor either. How can a middle-aged and elderly woman with such a vicious heart and no experience of feelings understand the feeling of liking someone?" Seeing her getting closer, Tang Ning crossed her arms, looked at her and asked, "Do you want to wait until you get closer so you can release the poison?" The middle-aged woman paused, looked at him, and said in a cold voice, "It's really you. You were the one who cured their poison." Tang Ning was non-committal, and the middle-aged woman asked again, "The art of poison was lost more than 10 years ago, and it is even less likely to appear in Chen country. Who taught you the art of poison?" Tang Ning glanced at her and asked, "Are you 100,000 wise? If you don't say it now, you will say it later." The middle-aged woman said coldly, flicked her sleeves, and several black lights shot out from her sleeves, heading straight for Tang Ning and Li Tianlan. Brush. A silver bolt passed in front of Tang Ning's eyes. Li Tianlan stood with a sword in his hand. Several goo worms released by the middle-aged woman were cut into several pieces by him and kept twisting on the ground. The middle-aged woman's expression remained unchanged and she said calmly, "Do you think this is the end?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Are you trying to say that even if the silver thread snake goo is cut off, it can still survive and parasitize in the host's body?" The middle-aged woman's complexion changed for the first time, which was a characteristic of the silver-threaded snake voodoo. Since he knew this, why did he still stand there and not hide away? As if she thought of something, she immediately looked to the ground. She saw that the goo worms that had been cut off just now did not get into the bodies of the 2 people as she expected, but were constantly squirming under their feet. If you observe more carefully, you can see that they are not squirming, but trembling or surrendering. Having practiced voodoo for many years, she certainly knew why this happened. You have eye silkworm goo on your body. The middle-aged woman's face changed drastically and she asked sternly, she taught you the voodoo technique. What is your relationship with her? Bai even gave you the eye silkworm goo. Who's surnamed Bai? Tang Ning glanced at her. Most of his goo skills came from Sume. She also lent him the eye silkworm goo and told him to keep it safe. Could it be that this woman and Sume, what does it matter? Who is the surname Bai? The middle-aged woman suddenly became excited. She drew her sword and pointed it at Tang Ning, loudly saying, "Tell me, who taught you your voodoo skills?" Clang. After the sound of gold and iron clashing, Li Tianlan was already standing in front of Tang Ning. The two swords collided, and the middle-aged woman took a few steps back, snorted coldly, and stepped forward again. Tang Ning was originally a little worried about Li Tianlan, but when she saw that she and this middle-aged woman were fighting together and not losing at all, she felt relieved. With him by his side, this middle-aged woman's goo art will not have much effect. People who are proficient in goo art are generally not very good at martial arts. Although this middle-aged woman is considered a master, after more than 10 moves, he was completely suppressed by Li Tianlan. At this time, there was movement outside the forest. A group of people rushed into the forest from the official road. The middle-aged woman threw away Li Tianlan and came straight towards Tang Ning. She grabbed his shoulder. Tang Ning raised her hand and grabbed her wrist and turned it around. The middle-aged woman's attack missed. Li Tianlan had already walked over quickly. The middle-aged woman glanced at Tang Ning with an unwilling expression and flew deeper into the forest. However, as soon as she flew a few feet away, her body trembled and she fell to the ground. Su Ling walked over quickly and asked, "Princess, are you okay?" Li Tianlan shook his head and said, "It's okay." Tang Ning walked up to the middle-aged woman and asked, "How are you doing? Doesn't it feel like being poisoned?" The middle-aged woman behaved mischievously just because she knew how to use poison and voodoo. Tang Ning was just treating the other person the same way. This trip to Chu State was an arduous task and full of dangers. The things he used to pack the bottom of the box were not just one or two. The old beggar's poison technique and Sume's goo technique were not inherited from the same lineage. Sometimes, poison the technique is much easier to use than the voodoo technique. Tang Ning stood up, looked at Li Tianlan, and said, "Leave this person to me. This middle-aged woman obviously has something to do with Sume. Tang Ning plans to take her back to ask. What's more, she has repeatedly attacked him. If she doesn't give her some color along the way, it will be difficult to vent the evil in his heart." Li Tianlan looked at him and warned, "Be careful." Tang Ning said, "Don't worry, she won't be able to regain any strength within 12 hours. Su Ling came over with a team of people. Even if the two of them wanted to be gentle for a while, they had no chance. On the official road, King Zhou jumped down from the carriage, looked at the tied-up middle-aged woman, and said in surprise, "Master Tang, this is the woman who escaped from the second prince." Tang Ning looked at King Zhou and explained, "The princess and I went to catch the assassin." King Zhou's eyes stayed on his face for a moment, especially on his lips, and he smiled and said, "This woman has committed a heinous crime. It would be great to catch her." Su Ling came over, knelt down on one knee, cupped his hands and said, "Mr. Tang's life-saving grace will be unforgettable by Su. If there is an opportunity in the future, I will definitely repay you." Several generals who had been cured of the poison by his kindness also came forward to thank him. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "We are all our own people, so you don't need to be so polite. Get up, get up." Li Tianlan came over and everyone quickly backed away. She looked up at Tang Ning and said, "Let's go." Tang Ning nodded and said, "I'll wait for you." Her eyes stayed on Tang Ning for a long time before she turned around and got into the carriage. We walked. "Master Tang, goodbye." The generals got on their horses and waved goodbye to Tang Ning. King Zhou stuck his head out of the carriage, thought for a while, and said, "Brother Tang, you." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "What else does the prince want?" King Zhou pointed to his lips, looked at him, and said, "To avoid misunderstanding, Brother Tang should wipe off the lipstick on his lips first when he goes back." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 413. Lipstick was the lipstick of later generations. After being reminded by King Zhou, Tang Ning wiped off her lipstick with the handkerchief given by Li Tianlan and watched them disappear on the official road. It wasn't until he couldn't see even a shadow in front of him that he slowly withdrew his gaze. 3 years is neither short nor too long. Without enough status, it is not easy to marry a princess wife openly, let alone two. After all, he is not an emperor. He can marry whoever he wants. To solve this problem, there is almost only one way to rebel. But which one is rebelling? Although regarding the matter of rebellion, he has a complete set of procedures in his mind with rich theoretical experience, but firstly, the name is not justified, and secondly, no matter who rebels against the two father-in-laws, from now on the relationship between husband and wife is difficult to be harmonious and is not an option. Tang Ning was caught in a dilemma for a moment and had a slight headache. Anyway, he couldn't figure it out for a while. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. He should go back to Kangzhou first. Zhao Man was still waiting at the inn. He picked up the middle-aged woman and threw her on the horse. This woman had a very vicious heart. Tang Ning did not regard her as a woman at all. He let her lie on the horse, looked back again, raised her riding whip, and headed towards Kangzhou. Go in the direction of the city. Kangzhou, in. Zhao Man paced in the yard, looking at Tang Shui from time to time, and asked, "Cousin, why hasn't he come back yet?" Tang Shui looked at her and said, "Princess, just call me Tang Shui." Zhao Man ran over, took her hand, and said, "There are no outsiders here. You are his cousin, which is also my cousin." Tang Shui looked at her and sighed in his heart. She had met Princess Pingyang many times before, but had she ever been so polite to her? This cousin of his is good at everything, but the best thing is his love with women. His Majesty's favorite princess is obviously completely enamored with him. The Princess of Chu's love for him can even be seen by a blind man. Not all of them, even Sumei, who was known as the most beautiful woman in the capital, seemed to have some other motives for him. Zhao Man seemed to have thought of something, and suddenly asked nervously, "Cousin, will he not come back?" Tang Shui comforted him helplessly, "No, just wait." Zhao Man was bored playing with the whip in the yard. At a certain moment, Tang Ning walked in from the door and said, "I'm back." Zhao Man immediately dropped his whip and ran over. He looked around and when he saw Tang Ning was alone, his eyes narrowed. Thinking of what had just happened in the room, she felt a little shy, whispered "You are back" and ran back to the room. Tang Shui looked at him and asked, "She's gone?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "Let's go. I was on a mission to Chu State, and there were 2 more princesses by my side." Tang Shui took out his handkerchief, stretched out his hand to wipe the corners of his mouth, and said, "I'll see how you explain to Xiao Ru Xiaoi when you get back. A man is a man who dares to take action. As women, Zhao Man and Li Tianlan are so brave, decisive, affectionate and righteous, so he cannot be timid and shy. As for how to explain to them, the worst case scenario would be to go back and sleep in the study alone." 2 guards escorted the middle-aged woman in. Chen Zhou stepped forward and said, "Sir, we have brought her." Tang Ning looked at her, then at Chen Zhou, and said, "From now on, just tie her up casually, don't take it so seriously." Chen Zhou cupped his hands and said, "My subordinates know." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Bring her in first." Seeing Chen Zhou escorting the middle-aged woman in, Tang Shui looked at him and asked, "Who is she?" Tang Ning explained, the woman who ran away from the second prince, I have something to ask her. Tang Ning walked into the room, looked at Chen Zhou, and ordered, find a chair for her to sit on. Although she was good at martial arts, she couldn't use any strength in her whole body, and she was bumpy all the way. Now she can stand up pretty well. Tang Ning moved a chair to sit opposite her and asked, name. The middle-aged woman opened her eyes, looked at him indifferently, and then closed her eyes again. Tang Ning finally understood why Wan Yanyan never took herself as a hostage. Like a master, there must be a disciple. It turned out that her master was even more arrogant than her. He stretched out his hand, and on his palm lay a small beetle. He looked at the middle-aged woman and asked, do you know what this is? The middle-aged woman opened her eyes again and said calmly, the only people in this world who know how to refine epilepsy goo are me and Bai. You are her apprentice. Didn't she tell you my name? I don't know the person named Bai you mentioned. Tang Ning looked at her and said, you'd better be honest. I'm not the second prince, so I won't be polite to you. You know the epilepsy goo and what will happen if you are bitten by it? Like. You have epilepsy goo and I silkworm goo. It's impossible for you not to know her. The middle-aged woman looked at him and said, where did your epilepsy goo and I silkworm goo come from? Tang Ning patted the table and said, are you asking me or am I asking you? The middle-aged woman frowned and said, don't you know Bai Jin? Never heard of it. Tang Ning looked at her and said, let me ask you one last time, what is your name? The middle-aged woman looked at him deeply and said, Gong Sun Ying. Tang Ning took a sip of tea and asked, what is the purpose of you and the second prince coming to Chu? The middle-aged woman said calmly, destroy the alliance between Chen and Chu and prevent King Xian from ascending to the throne. The purpose of the Wanyan department was very simple. They tried their best to weaken the strength of the two countries. Unfortunately, the team they sent was too weak. In addition to her and Wei Nianyun, even the second prince was sacrificed. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, you are a Han Chinese, why do you want to work for them? The middle-aged woman looked directly at him and asked, you are from the Chen kingdom. Your princess is married to a prince. Why do you work for King Xian of the Chu kingdom? Tang Ning explained, because King Xian is my father-in-law. This reason is enough. One is the good-for-nothing prince who stole his woman, and the other is his future father-in-law. It couldn't be easier to help whom or not. Although this cheap father-in-law always dislikes him, always digs holes for him to jump into, and even wants him and Lan Lan to become sworn brothers and sisters, in the end, the cheap father-in-law is also a father-in-law. The middle-aged woman opened her mouth, speechless. Tang Ning looked at her and said, it's your turn to answer. The middle-aged woman closed her eyes and said, everyone is his own master. Tang Ning looked at her. It was really evil to be her master. In the end, he didn't even leave a whole body behind. She always felt that there was something suspicious about this woman, but she couldn't tell where it was. Based on what she said, she seemed to have something to do with Sume. I'll wait until I go back and ask her what the specific relationship is. Tang Ning looked at Chen Zhou and said, take her down first. Chen Zhou nodded, waved his hand and said, take it away. After walking out of the door, a guard looked at Chen Zhou, thought for a moment, and asked, boss, do you need to untie her and send her to Master Tang's room? Chen Zhou looked at the middle-aged woman with a sallow complexion, slapped the guard on the head, and said angrily, you are blind, you can loosen up as much as you want, and give away as much as you want, find a rope to tie it tightly, in the woodshed. The guard looked at him and said, aren't all the hostages in the past untied? Can it be the same now as before? Chen Zhou slapped his head again and said angrily, are you stupid? Are you stupid? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 414. It had been several days since Li Tianlan and King Zhou set out from Kangzhou, and they might have arrived in Kyoto, but Tang Ning and the others were still staying in Kangzhou. 2 days ago, he planned to set off, but was stopped by Zhao Man. She has been shopping extensively in the city these past 2 days, and the things she bought have already filled several large carts. When she once again wanted to take Tang Ning's arm and go to the street, Tang Ning quickly grabbed her and said, "These things are enough, there is no need to buy any more." Zhao Man said, "It's hard to come out once, buy more, go back and give it to Sister Xiru and Sister Xiaoi, do you think they will like it? You've already bought enough." Tang Ning looked at her and said helplessly, "They will be happy after receiving it." Zhao Man raised her head and said, "But I want to buy more for them." If she bought it again, she would probably occupy a few more cars. Tang Ning quickly said, okay, the whole family doesn't have to be so polite." Zhao Man blushed and said, "A family must treat them well." After finally convincing her, Lu Teng came over and asked when he would set off. "We set off in March, and now it's mid-August. Half the year has almost passed, and we can't afford to waste time." Tang Ning looked at him and said, "Let them pack up and leave early tomorrow morning." Kyoto. After the imperial army set off for the expedition, Her Royal Highness the Princess returned to Kyoto in just 10 days. The King of Zhou and the generals from the 5 states also followed the princess back to Beijing to plead guilty. The people originally thought that Her Royal Highness the Princess led the troops to conquer the war, and conquered the rebels in a very short time. It was not until the edict was posted on the city wall that they understood the whole story. It turns out that the rebellion of the King of Zhou was actually caused by the prairie people who wanted to bring trouble to the Chu kingdom under the guise of the King of Zhou. Being designed by the grassland people to rebel against their own country was like a slap in the face to every common person in Chu state. Thinking again that they were pretending to negotiate peace, but actually colluding with the prince to harm King Xian who had not yet ascended the throne at the time, the grassland people's wolfish ambitions became obvious. For a time, the people in Beijing were all angry, and there were many who wanted to jointly submit a letter requesting the imperial court to send troops to the grassland. Fortunately, it was stated in the edict that all the thieves, including the second prince of the grassland, had been killed by the Kangzhou garrison led by the princess, so the people's resentment subsided somewhat. In this incident, even if the King of Zhou had no intention of rebellion, it almost led to a big mistake. Failure to deal with it would not be enough to anger the people. It is not allowed by law or by human reason. The edict also stated the results of his treatment. Although his title of prince was retained, he could only stay in the capital for the rest of his life. It was a kind of imprisonment in disguise, and he only had the fictitious title of a prince. In addition, as for those rebel generals who were also at fault, according to the law, rebellion was a serious crime that would punish the 9 tribes. However, because they had no choice but to avoid death, they were also removed from their positions and sent to the border with the grassland. Dedicate one's crime and make meritorious service. Under the palace wall, it was almost filled with people. Those prairie barbarians deserve to die, the princess is so powerful. If I had known that Her Royal Highness could deal with those barbarians earlier, I wouldn't have needed to mobilize so many troops. Those barbarians are so arrogant. Your Highness should capture them and execute them one by one. Princess Changning has a very high reputation among the people of Chu state. Although she is a woman, her achievements put all the men in Chu state to shame. 3 years ago, she disguised herself as a man to take part in the scientific examination, and became the first and youngest #1 scholar in the history of Chu state. Before that, she even personally led troops to drive back the prairie barbarians who entered the Chu kingdom to plunder back to their hometown. Princess Changning's achievements don't stop there. She is capable of both literary and military skills and is well versed in government affairs. At the age of 15, She was able to put forward her own opinions on court affairs and criticize current ills. Even His Majesty praised her many times. A year ago, she went on a mission to the state of Chen. After returning, she proposed many new policies. The most important of them was the use of many measures to improve flood problems in many places, saving the court a lot of water control expenses every year. Princess Changning is a legend in the Chu kingdom, and the suppression of the rebellion this time has added another significant touch to her legendary road. In the noodle shop on the street, the old noodle seller brought her a bowl of hot plain noodles and said with a smile, "Princess has done something big this time. It's almost crazy outside." Li Tianlan looked at her and said, "Mother-in-law, I have something to tell you." The old woman sat down opposite her and said with a smile, "Go ahead, my mother-in-law is listening." After a moment, after hearing what Li Tianlan said, she stood up suddenly and said in shock, You really?" Li Tianlan blushed rarely and nodded slightly. The old woman looked at her in shock, then sighed for a long time and murmured, "Old woman, if I had been as brave as you, I wouldn't be selling noodles here now. I think that boy really likes you." She thought for a while and then said, "However, that boy knows how to coax girls at first glance. There must be many girls who like her. If you follow her in the future, you have to be careful. Watch carefully, if he dares to mess around with others, you will deal with him severely. There is a powerful person next to that boy. Come, my mother-in-law will teach you a few more tricks." Royal Palace. In the imperial study room, the former King Xian, now the Emperor of Chu, sat in front of the chessboard, picked up a chess piece, and after thinking about it, he looked to the opposite side and said, "I haven't seen you for many years, but you don't have any chess skills at all. If you step back, I can't beat you." King Zhou shook his head and said, "My brother has been bored these years and has only played chess. Brother Huang has to worry about national affairs, so it is normal for his chess skills to be rusty." The new Emperor Li Shan finally made his move and asked casually, "Do you have any complaints about me leaving you in Kyoto?" King Zhou slowly picked up a chess piece and said, "My brother is eager to stay in Kyoto and enjoy the blessings. Brother Huang doesn't know how dangerous the outside world is. The bug that the woman put into my body was 3 inches long. If it weren't for Brother Tang, I won't be able to see my brother today." Li Shan looked at him and asked, "Brother Tang?" King Zhou explained, "It's Tang Ning, Chen's wedding envoy." Li Shan curled his lips and said, "That bastard knows some crooked ways." King Zhou was startled, "Bastard?" Li Shan waved his hand and said, "Let's not talk about him anymore, let's play chess." King Zhou looked at him and suddenly said, "Speaking of him, there is something I wonder if my brother knows." Li Shan picked up a chess piece and asked casually, "What's the matter?" King Zhou thought for a while and said, "According to my observation, Tang Ning and Xiaolan." Li Shan stopped moving his hands, raised his head and asked, "What happened to him and Lan Lan? If my brother's guess is correct." King Zhou thought for a moment and then said, "Xiaolan and him should have made a private decision for life." "What did you say?" Li Shan stood up suddenly, knocked the chessboard over, and said loudly, "What is a private lifelong decision?" King Zhou looked at the chess pieces scattered on the ground, was stunned for a moment, and asked, "Brother Huang, doesn't he know?" "What do I know?" Li Shan murmured with an angry look on his face, no wonder she has been acting weird since she came back, no wonder she wants to put down the rebellion by herself." He walked out of the palace angrily. King Zhou stood up and asked, "Where are you going, Brother Huang? You won't be going fishing for a while." Li Shan waved his hand angrily, "Lan Lan was caught by someone, and he caught a shitty fish." Fortunate young gentleman author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 415. Kangzhou was already close to the south of Chu State. A few days after setting off, the team had already sailed out of Liaozhou, and further on, they reached the territory of Chen State. Ah sneeze. Tang Ning rubbed her nose. Although they were driving south all the way, the weather was getting colder and colder now that it was autumn. Zhao Man had to be reminded to change into a thicker quilt at night. Ahead was Shililan. When they came, they encountered an ambush there. Thanks to his wit, he exchanged hostages with the other party, and the crisis was eliminated. Hirui got off the carriage and looked at the forest ahead with a complicated expression. Lu Teng rode over and said, "I'm afraid I'm going to sleep in the forest again tonight." Then Speed Up Tang Ning looked at the forest ahead and said, "Stay one night today and rest in Fengzhou tomorrow night." Lu Teng nodded, looked behind him, and said, "Keep going." As the team approached, a figure suddenly appeared in the forest. The Imperial Guards first put on a defensive posture, but seeing that there were only a few people on the other side, they went over to a team to inquire about the situation. Not long after, Lu Teng brought a few people over and said, "Master Tang, they are the bandit leaders of Shililan. They are here to lead us this time." The leader immediately said, "No, no, no, General, we have become good and are no longer thieves." The man looked at Tang Ning and said expectantly, "Sir, we have now become good and no longer thieves? We will listen to your instructions every day, do more good deeds, punish evil and promote good." Tang Ning almost forgot about this problem, nodded and said, "You guys did a good job." The man rubbed his hands and said, "In that case, sir, can you give us the antidote? We guarantee that after taking the antidote, we will still be the same as before, only doing good things, not doing bad things, punishing evil and promoting good. Accumulate blessings." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Actually, you are not poisoned. If he is poisoned now, it will take effect a year later. I don't know if there is such a high-tech poison in the world, at least Tang Ning herself doesn't have this ability." The man was startled, then laughed dryly and said, "Young master is joking." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "You don't believe me?" The man trembled and immediately said, "Believe, believe, we will still do more good deeds in the future. 1 year from now, you must send someone to deliver the antidote." He didn't believe the truth, and there was nothing Tang Ning could do. The bandit leader didn't dare to say anything more and said with a smile, "Young man, go ahead and lead the way." With these local snakes leading the way, this trip from Shililan to Fengzhou was much smoother than last time. When they arrived in Fengzhou, Tang Ning was surprised to find that what the bandit leader said was actually true. Whether they have reformed their evil ways in their hearts or not, at least they have done so in action. In the past 2 months, Fengzhou suddenly had a good gang with hundreds of brothers. With the purpose of doing good deeds and spreading love, they built bridges and paved roads. The top priority is to fight local gangsters and punish gangsters, which has won a lot of applause from the people in Fengzhou. Regardless of whether they were sincere or not, their actions were commendable. Tang Ning threw a packet of medicinal powder to him and said, "Dissolve in a bowl of water, and everyone can detoxify by taking a sip." This medicinal powder was actually rouge bought from Chu State. It was made of flower petals. It was all natural and had no additives. He bought a lot of it when he came back this time. In addition to buying it for Zhao Yuan, there were many more. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, sir." The former leader of the Shililan bandit, now the leader of the good guys gang, knelt on the ground and burst into tears of gratitude. Tang Ning waved her hand, indicating that he could leave. He walked back to the inn, and when he saw Chenzhou, he warned, "Watch that woman, don't let her run away." "Don't worry, sir." Chenzhou patted his chest and said, "I used 3 ropes, but I have never tied a pig so tightly. The more she struggles, the tighter she becomes. She can't run away." Tang Ning patted his shoulder and said, "Not bad." Although she was a prisoner like Wan Yanyan, the treatment of Lady Gongsun here was not so good. She was good at martial arts and knew the art of voodoo. Although Tang Ning found all her voodoos and burned them, to avoid accidents, she was tied up along the way and was not qualified to ride in a carriage alone. Instead, she was stuffed. There was no separate room for her in the truck or at the inn, so she had to make do in the woodshed. There is no need to be careless when dealing with such dangerous elements. On the way back, he was eager to return home and was not willing to delay at all. It was already afternoon when he arrived at Fengzhou, and he planned to set off again tomorrow morning. If there is no delay on the way, we can go back in early October. He walked back to the yard. Lao Zheng held the knife in his hand, walked around the yard, and asked, "Have you seen my whetstone?" No. Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Go and ask the cook. There must be some at the inn." Lao Zheng's knife is not often used, but he always likes to sharpen it. He takes it out to sharpen it every 2 days. I don't know what his hobby is. When it comes to using a knife, he just likes to use it to cut pig ears and drink wine at night. Tang Ning had to admit that the pig ears cut by Lao Zheng were of moderate thickness and tasted better than those cut by ordinary butchers. Butcher Zheng walked to the kitchen and asked the cook, who was busy in front of the stove, "Is there a whetstone?" The cook was busy cooking and said without looking back, "Yes, it's in the woodshed next door. You can go find it yourself." Butcher Zheng pushed open the wooden door of the woodshed and started looking around. A middle-aged woman was tied to a pillar in the middle of the woodshed, and Butcher Zheng's eyes swept across her body. The middle-aged woman looked at him, and at a certain moment, she suddenly asked, "What are you looking for?" Butcher Zheng looked around and asked, "Have you seen a whetstone?" The middle-aged woman lowered her head, raised her foot and stepped down again, saying, "It's under my feet, come and get it." Butcher Zheng looked over and found a dark stone under her feet. He walked to the middle-aged woman and bent down. The middle-aged woman's eyes narrowed slightly and her eyebrows raised. At the same time, a strand of hair on her head suddenly fell, twisted a few times in the air, and went straight to Butcher Zheng's face like a living thing. On closer inspection, it was found that the thing was much thicker than the hair, and it was about to get into Butcher Zheng's nose in an instant. The middle-aged woman had a sneer on her face. It was her most precious silver snake king gu, which was usually hidden in her hair, and it was also her last trick to save her life. The silver snake king was extremely fast. Even a top expert couldn't dodge it at such a close distance, let alone an ordinary butcher. Butcher Zheng raised his head and pinched the creature's head with his hand. The body was still twisting. He rubbed it with his thumb and index finger, and the creature stopped struggling and remained motionless. He clapped his hands, as if to brush off dust, looked up at the middle-aged woman, and said, "The Silver Snake King is hiding deep enough." The middle-aged woman's eyes narrowed and she trembled. "How do you know?" The person in front of her not only knew the Silver Snake King, but also killed her most powerful poisonous insect like killing an ant. While destroying the middle-aged woman's last hope, she was also extremely surprised. Butcher Zheng shook his head and said, "There are not many people left in the Wanggu section. Why are they running to the grassland to join in the fun instead of passing on the sect?" When the middle-aged woman heard the 3 words Wanggu sect, her face changed for the first time and she said sternly, "Who are you?" "I'm just a butcher. I don't mean anything else." "You just stepped on my grindstone." Butcher Zheng squatted on the ground and said, "Be good, lift your feet." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 416. Butcher Zheng took the whetstone from under her feet, stood up, turned around and left without looking at her again. The middle-aged woman looked pale and trembled. "Who are you? Why do you know about the Wanggu sect? You are from Daliang." Butcher Zheng waved his hand and said, "It's all in the past." He walked out, closed the door of the woodshed, and when he came to the yard, he could no longer hear the sound inside. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "What is that woman yelling about?" Butcher Zheng said, "Maybe the rope is tied too tight. Let someone loosen it for her, so that she can retain some dignity as a master." Old Zheng's plea was like a rare flower blooming on an iron tree. Tang Ning stretched out his hand to call Chen Zhou and said, "Go and help her loosen it and change the way she is tied." When he walked to the yard where Zhao Man was, she and Tang Shui were standing in the yard. They ran over and said, "My cousin just taught me a trick. Do you want to see it?" Since Wan Yanyan gave her whip to Zhao Man, she has completely embarked on a wrong path. Tang Ning does not want her to return to the right path. He only hopes that she can be down to earth and practice whipping well, and never take a more wrong path again. In Kyoto, it is already October. People are forgetful. There are new things happening in Kyoto every day. As the year draws to a close, few people remember what happened at the beginning of the year. When Princess Pingyang got married, it was a sensation in the capital. However, more than half a year has passed. If no one had mentioned it deliberately, the people would have long forgotten the grand event when the princess left the capital in early March. The officials of the Ministry of Rites would naturally not forget it, because today is the day when the princess returns to the capital. The previous king of Chu died suddenly, and he abolished the crown prince before his death. The marriage between the two countries was annulled. The delegation set out from the capital of Chu more than 2 months ago and arrived today. The doctors of the 3 departments, the Ministry of Shrines, the Ministry of Food, and the Ministry of Hosts and Guests, went out of the city to greet them personally. Standing at the city gate, the faces of the 3 people were equally gloomy. The doctor of the Ministry of Shrines sighed and said, "He is back after all." The doctor of the Ministry of Food looked worried and sighed, "What should I do? How about?" The doctor of the host thought for a while and said, "Let's take a month off first." The doctor of the Ministry of Food hesitated and said, "If the 3 of us take leave at the same time, I am afraid it will cause criticism." "Isn't that bad? Is it more important to avoid criticism or to have a future and a life?" The doctor of the Ministry of Shrines shook his head and said, "Half a year ago, how did he become a wedding envoy? Have you forgotten the fate of the previous doctor of the Ministry of Rites? A temporary head of the Ministry of Rites naturally cannot be a wedding envoy, but he stepped on the bodies of several of them and sat in that position. Before leaving, he had been appointed as a doctor of the Ministry of Rites by His Majesty. This time when they come back, won't the 3 of them repeat the same mistakes?" The doctor of the Ministry of Rites waved his hand and said, "I don't care about criticism or not. I will take leave when I go back. When he leaves the Ministry of Rites, I will come back." The doctor of the Ministry of Food thought about it and gritted his teeth and said, "Me too." The doctor of the Ministry of Hosts hesitated for a moment and also said, "I will find Minister Lu when I go back." The 3 of them talked in a low voice again, and suddenly there was a noisy sound from the crowd behind them. They looked up and saw a black line appear at the end of their sight. Someone in the crowd at the city gate shouted loudly, "The princess is back in Beijing." Tang Ning stood at the city gate and calculated in his mind that more than half a year ago, the delegation set out from the capital and went to the capital of Chu State. It took more than 3 months, and it only took 2.5 months to come back. This is because on the way back, they did not stop when they met a city, and they traveled almost for days. If they had not been delayed in Chu State because of the rebellion, it would have been faster. In fact, most of their time on this mission was delayed on the road. After returning to the capital, officials from the Ministry of Rites had already greeted them at the city gate, and they would go directly to the palace to report to the emperor. When they arrived in Beijing, it was already past noon, and the morning court had already ended. The place where Emperor Chen met them was the imperial study. Tang Ning, Lu Tang, and He Rui walked in and bowed at the same time, saying, "Your Majesty, I am here to see you." Emperor Chen looked at them and nodded, saying, "No need to be polite." Tang Ning did not stand up, but clasped his fists and said, "I have failed Your Majesty's trust and the trust of the court. Please forgive me, Your Majesty." Lu Teng and He Rui also bowed at the same time and said, "Please forgive me, Your Majesty." Emperor Chen waved his hand and said, even I did not expect that such a big change would happen in the state of Chu in the past 6 months. It is not your fault. Please don't be polite. Thank you, Your Majesty. Tang Ning bowed his hands, stood up, took something out of his sleeve, handed it over, and said, Your Majesty, this is the letter from the current king of Chu, please take a look. Immediately, an eunuch stepped forward, took the letter from him, and presented it. Although the letter was a very serious thing and needed to be presented in person after returning to Beijing, the content of the letter had actually been sent back before they arrived in Beijing. Emperor Chen glanced at it, put it down, and said with a complicated expression, the Chu state today is no longer the vassal of my Chen state. The atmosphere in the hall was a little dull until a figure ran in from outside the hall. Father, father. Zhao Man ran to Emperor Chen and said aggrievedly, I thought I would never see you again. The moment he saw her, the expression on Emperor Chen's face was a moment of regret, and then a trace of relief, and finally turned into a smile, saying, Manner has worked hard along the way. Zhao Man grabbed his sleeve and said, Manner doesn't want to go so far. Manner wants to stay in Kyoto to accompany father for the rest of her life. Okay. Emperor Chen smiled and nodded, saying, I'll have someone clean up your Changning palace. Zhao Man shook her head and said, Father, Manner has grown up. It's not in accordance with etiquette for her to live in the palace. I'd better live in the princess's mansion outside the palace. I will still come to the palace to accompany father often. That's fine. Emperor Chen looked down and said, I'll talk to Manner. You can leave first. Tang Ning's heart had already flown back home. He was just waiting for him to say this. Hearing this, he immediately bowed and said, I'll take my leave. When he was about to leave, he saw Zhao Man with her back to Emperor Chen, blinking at him, and mouthing, Wait for me. The carriage had been waiting at the gate of the palace for a long time. When it arrived at the gate of Tang Mansion, Tang Ning got off the carriage and saw a group of people waiting at the gate. He walked forward, looked at the two girls standing in the front, opened his arms, and whispered, I'm back. Xiao Xiao and Fang Xinyu stood behind them, their faces full of smiles. Butcher Zheng held his daughter and stood aside, covering her eyes with his hands, saying, Don't look, girl. Lying on the bed in the morning, with his arms around Xiaoai and Xiru, Tang Ning once again deeply realized that no matter how high an official he was or what great things he did, he would not be as happy as hugging two ladies like this. Zhongai struggled to get up from the bed, blushing and saying, Husband, it's almost noon, we have to get up quickly, otherwise people will laugh at us. So are you also wanted to get up? Tang Ning's arms tightened around them again, saying, This is the Tang Mansion, who dares to laugh at us? Zhongai lowered his head and whispered, My parents said last night that they would come over in the morning. Judging from the light coming through the window, it was already noon, which meant that his father-in-law and mother-in-law had been waiting for a whole morning, and even Tang Ning felt embarrassed no matter how thick-skinned he was. It was already past noon, and the two of them were too embarrassed to ask the maid to come in after getting dressed. After washing up, they sat in front of the dressing table to dress themselves. Let me do it. Tang Ning walked over, took the eyebrow pencil from Zhong Yi's hand, and gently helped her draw her eyebrows. More than half a year ago, when he first helped her draw eyebrows, she was still shy, but later she became more generous, which was also a kind of boudoir fun for them. After helping her draw, he started to draw for Xiao Ru. Zhong Yi sat in front of the bronze mirror, looked in the mirror carefully, looked at Tang Ning, and said puzzledly, My husband has been away for a few months, and his eyebrow drawing skills seem to have improved a lot. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 417. That's natural, Tang Ning explained while tracing Xiao Ru's eyebrows. I learned this from Xiu'er. On the way to Chu Kingdom, the princess felt bored and wanted to go out, so I used her to practice my skills and took her to steal. If you run out, your skills will naturally improve over time. If you practice more with her, you won't make mistakes when painting for you. I must tell them about this matter, but not now. I have some things to do during the day, and I will confess to them in the evening. Zhongyi breathed a sigh of relief and said, fortunately, it was just a near miss this time. It's great that the husband and princess can come back safely. With me here, how can there be any danger? Tang Ning smiled and said, the princess came back this time and bought many gifts for you. After helping them draw their eyebrows, Tang Ning had already dressed and walked out of the room while they were changing clothes. Zhongyi sat on the edge of the bed and sighed softly. Su Ru looked up at her and said in surprise, sister, what's wrong? Zhongyi looked at her and asked, silly sister, if it were you, would you let a man other than your husband draw your eyebrows for you? Of course I don't want to. Su Ru shook her head and said, no one can do it except brother Xiaoning. After she finished speaking, she seemed to realize something. She raised her head and asked, sister, do you mean that the princess likes brother Ning? Zhongyi nodded and said, I saw it before the princess left the capital. Su Ru was stunned for a moment, then asked, then, what should we do? I wonder when my husband will confess. If he continues to hide it from us, let her sleep in the study for a month. Zhongyi snorted, looked at her again, and said, I know you always turn to my husband, but you can't tell him about this matter. There are so many women who like my husband-in-law. We sisters must be of the same mind, otherwise, we will have many more sisters in the family in the future. Su Ru held her arm and said, I know, sister, don't worry. Tang Ning walked to the yard and saw Qing'er walking over with a wooden basin. She looked at her and asked, Qing'er, what are you doing? Qing'er raised her head and said, Master and Madam have been waiting for a long time. I will help the young lady dress up. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, no need, they will come out after changing their clothes. Oh, Qing'er nodded cutely and said, then I'll pour the water. Wait a minute. Tang Ning thought of something and stopped her, asking, where's Tang Yao Yao? Why didn't I see her yesterday? Isn't she in the capital? She's here. Qing'er shook her head and said, she came here yesterday morning before my uncle came back. Yesterday, even Fang Xiaoyu skipped school and ran over to greet him. Tang Yajing still hasn't shown her face yet. Tang Ning stood in the yard and whispered, if you don't even show your face, you are still not a friend. It's really shameful. Tang Yao Yao flew over from outside the wall and said angrily, who are you talking about? Tang Ning looked at her and said in surprise, are you listening to Chiang Zhen? Why listen to Chiang Zhen? I happen to hear you saying bad things about me. Tang Yao Yao glared at him and asked, where is my gift? Tang Ning waved her hand and said, they're all in the car. You can take your pick when the time comes. Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and said, if you have some conscience, I've been watching the store for you for the past 6 months. This sentence was wrong. Tang Ning looked at her and said, this is not only my shop, but also your shop. These shops are like our common children. Tang Yao Yao's face turned red and she said in embarrassment, bah, who has a child with you? I am a metaphor. Metaphors don't work either. Tang Ning stopped making metaphors. Tang Yao Yao looked at him dissatisfied and said, during this period, I am responsible for everything by myself, and you didn't even say a word about your hard work. Okay, okay. Tang Ning said without fussing with her, you've worked hard over the past 6 months. Tang Yao Yao slapped her hand on the stone table and became even more angry, do you think it's over just by saying hard work? Tang Ning was stunned and then said, from now on, I will do everything. How about you take a good rest for a while? Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and asked, I managed so many shops with great difficulty, and you want to seize power just after you come back. Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, then held her forehead and said, then what do you think we should do? Tang Yaoyao did not continue to embarrass him. She glanced at him and asked, have you met Li Tianlan this time when you went to Chu State? I haven't seen her in more than a year. I miss her quite a bit. Actually, there's no need to miss her too much. Tang Ning looked at her and comforted her, there will be plenty of opportunities to see her in the future. Tang Yaoyao raised her eyebrows and asked, what? I mean, of course I met her. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, she is a princess now and is loved by the people. By the way, we even talked about you once. Tang Yaoyao's expression changed and she asked, what did she say about me? Tang Ning said, she said you were proactive, strong, and very charming. Tang Yaoyao curled her lips with a look of disbelief, she would say that about me. Tang Ning stretched out her hand and said, I swear, everything I said is true. I don't know if Tang Yaoyao believed it or not, but she just looked at him arrogantly and said, I want to see my gift. Before Tang Ning left Kyoto, she bought gifts for all of them. Zhao Man walked all the way back and bought a few more large cars. Now there were more than a dozen carriages parked in front of her house, including the maids and servants. Tang Ning picked out a cart full of gifts and personally brought them to Tianashanzhu. In fact, the person he should be most grateful to during this trip was Sumei. The things he used to save his life or pack the bottom of his suitcase were all given by her before leaving. He knocked on Sumei's courtyard door. No sound came from inside, but the courtyard door was open. Tang Ning pushed the door open and saw Xiao Tao squatting in the courtyard playing with snakes. Xiao Tao looked up at him, startled for a moment, then curled her lips, turned around, and pointed her butt towards him, clearly disdainful of him. He had been out for half a year, so naturally he had nothing to offend Xiao Tao. He walked over curiously and asked, what's wrong with you? Xiao Tao snorted, turned around, and continued to face him with her butt. Tang Ning ignored her and asked, where is your young lady? Xiao Tao curled her lips and said, go out. Tang Ning glanced at Xiao Tao again, who didn't know why she was sulking, then walked to the backyard and climbed over the wall. In the hidden courtyard, Tang Yu and Tang Shui were sitting in the pavilion, and Tang Shui was chattering to her. Tang Ning walked over, sat down, and said, Mom, I'm back. It's good to be back. Tang Yu smiled, glanced at Tang Shui, took out a bracelet from her sleeve, handed it to Tang Ning, and said, give this bracelet to the princess for your mother, that girl from Chu country, when she comes back, I will give it to her myself. Tang Ning looked at Tang Shui. Needless to say, she had already told everything. He took the bracelet and looked at it. The bracelet was of very good quality and could be regarded as the best of the best. More importantly, this kind of bracelet was available in Xiaoru, Xiaoi, and Tang Shui. Now he wanted to give it to Zhao Man. It sounds like one was left for Li Tianlan. Even Tang Ning didn't know how many bracelets like this she still had. At this time, Tang Yu looked at him again and said, when will you bring the princess over so that my mother can see? Tang Ning nodded slightly awkwardly and said, I'll bring her here in 2 days. He sat in the yard for half an hour before walking back to the front yard. Xiao Tao was no longer playing with snakes, and was sitting on the swing by himself. Tang Ning walked over and asked, your lady is not back yet? Huh? Xiao Tao glared at him and looked away. Tang Ning crossed her arms, looked at her, and asked in surprise, have I ever offended Miss Xiao Tao? You have never offended me. Xiao Tao jumped down from the swing, put her hands on her hips, and said angrily, but you took away the most precious goo insect, causing our young lady to be punished by her mother-in-law to kneel for 3 days and 3 nights. Tang Ning stood there and said in confusion, what did you say? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 418. From the performance of the Gongsun lady who was temporarily detained in the county jail, the eye silkworm Gu was extraordinary among the Gu insects and had the title of the king of all Gu. Along the way, Tang Ning used it to solve many problems and resolve many difficulties. But he didn't expect that the eye silkworm Gu was not owned by Su Mei, but she stole it from the old woman for him, and was severely punished for it. Xiao Tao curled her lips and said, "You don't know how good my young lady is to you." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Where did your young lady go and when will she come back?" Xiao Tao snorted coldly and turned her head away without saying anything. Tang Ning looked at her, walked out of the door, and said to several servants, "Move everything in." This time when he came to Tianrunju, he brought a whole car of gifts, half of which were for Su Mei. He picked a few gift boxes and handed them to Xiao Tao, saying, "This is a gift for you." Xiao Tao curled her lips and said, "Don't think you can bribe me with these gifts. What are these?" Tang Ning took a look and said, "Nothing, just rouge from Dianzhuang Pavilion and sachets from Fuyu Fang." "Ah," Xiao Tao exclaimed, her eyes lit up, and said, "Dianzhuang Pavilion is in the capital of Chu State. We don't sell it here at all. A box of rouge can be sold at a sky-high price in the capital, and there is no market for it. Fuyufang sachets are also famous, and few people in the capital have them. How could you, you just came back from Chu State." Tang Ning took the gift box back with regret and said, "I was wrong. I shouldn't have thought of bribing you with these things." When he wanted to put the gift box back, Xiao Tao rushed to him, hugged him tightly, and said, "The lady is out for work and will be back soon. Go to her room and wait for her." Tang Ning walked into Su Mei's room, pushed the door open, and saw a messy room and a messy bed. If the countless men in the capital knew that the goddess in their minds had such a scene in her room, I wonder what they would think. Xiao Tao was also an outlier among the maids. She only liked to play with snakes and didn't even know how to clean the room. Tang Ning had only seen this pair of master and servant. He walked to the table, sorted out the messy files on the table, and swept the waste paper on the ground and dumped it into the trash can in the corner of the yard. Finally, it was her bed. He folded the clothes and put them on the head of the bed. He folded the quilt halfway, thought about it and spread it out again. Anyway, he would have to spread it out later, so there was no need to do it in vain. So early, he had just made the bed when a familiar voice came from the door. Su Mei covered her mouth and coughed a few times, then walked in, looked at him and said, "A little separation is better than a new marriage. I thought you wouldn't get out of bed today." Tang Ning had always liked the way she drove, and when she heard her voice sounded a little strange, she looked up and asked, "What's wrong with your voice?" "It's just a little cold, it's nothing." Su Mei looked around the room and said, "Did you clean up everything here?" Tang Ning looked around and was very satisfied with her tidying up. She looked at her and said, "You should talk to Xiao Tao, don't let her be lazy all the time." Xiao Tao ran in from outside, glared at Tang Ning, and ignored him. She shook the things in her hands in front of Su Mei and said, "Miss, look, this is the rouge from Dianzhuang Pavilion, and the rouge from Fuyu Fang. Sachet." Su Mei looked at her and said, "Okay, take whatever you like, go out, remember to close the door." Xiao Tao closed the door and ran out. Tang Ning shook her head and said, "You spoil her too much." "Who made me the only relative?" Su Mei came over, sat on the bed, took off her coat, and said, "I watched her grow up." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "You still have me and mother, so if you are a brother, you are not a brother." "I accidentally said the wrong thing," Su Mei said in a coquettish voice, and got into the quilt, saying, "Good brother, just sit here and wait for me to wake up." Tang Ning envied her for being able to sleep whenever she wanted, and felt sorry for her suffering from insomnia. Since she met her, her complexion was not very good. At first, Tang Ning thought her insomnia was caused by mental fatigue, but later she gradually realized that it was not the case. This most beautiful woman in the capital, who could manipulate all the men in the capital with just a few moves, actually lacked a sense of security in her heart. This was generally related to her own experience, but Tang Ning didn't know what she had experienced before. He had tried tranquilizing incense, sleeping pills, and even acupressure, but none of them worked on her. Tranquilizing incense was useless to her. She had taken too many sleeping pills before, and now her body had developed drug resistance. As for acupressure, this was a method that was harmful to the body and could not be used multiple times. Moreover, she didn't know what strange kung fu she had practiced, and acupressure was useless to her. Tang Ning sat on the bed and was distracted for a while. When he looked down again, she had fallen asleep peacefully, breathing steadily. He raised his arm and smelled it, but didn't smell any special smell on him. He looked down at Sumei again. Her characteristic of falling asleep quickly as long as she was next to him was probably due to some psychological reasons. Thinking that her voice was a little strange and that she seemed to be coughing, Tang Ning stood up and prepared to take advantage of the free time to find a snow pear and boil it with honey. As soon as he stood up, Sumei suddenly held his hand. Although she was still asleep, her brows suddenly frowned and she murmured, "Don't leave me." Tang Ning had no choice but to sit down again, but she saw that she looked nervous and sweat was forming on her forehead. She said hurriedly, "Father, Mother, don't leave me behind, don't leave Mayer behind. Don't leave me. I will be obedient. If I don't eat food, I will give it all to my brother." She seemed to be having a nightmare, her body curled up together, and she kept mumbling to herself, her voice muffled. She was often dishonest when sleeping, and occasionally talked in her sleep, mostly in a vague way, so she couldn't hear her clearly this time. Tang Ning held her hand, took out a handkerchief, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and whispered, "No one will leave you behind." After a few words of comfort, her body gradually calmed down and her brows slowly relaxed. Tang Ning let her hold her hand and sat quietly in front of the bed. As soon as Sumei opened her eyes, she saw Tang Ning sitting on the edge of the bed looking at her. She slept extremely comfortably. She was full of energy at the moment. She looked at Tang Ning and asked, "How long have I slept?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "About an hour." Sumei was surprised, "So long?" Tang Ning said, "You wash up first, and I'll help you cook something." Sumei shook her head and said, "Just let Xiao Tao tell the kitchen to do it." Tang Ning said, "I'm going to cook a rock sugar pear to soothe your throat. They can't control the heat." A softness flashed in Sumei's eyes and she said, "Then go ahead." Tang Ning looked down and said, "You have to let go of my hand first." Only then did Sumei realize that she was still holding his hand, with their fingers clasped together. No wonder she felt very at ease after waking up. She reluctantly let go and said, "Go ahead. Tian Zhong has all the ingredients." Tang Ning prepared rock sugar and snow pear. When she returned to Sumei's room, she had already finished washing up. He put the bowl on the table and said, "Eat it while it's hot." Sumei took a sip of the soup first, and then said, "You went to Chu State this time, and you caused quite a stir." Tang Ning sat down opposite her and said, "Actually, we didn't do anything. It was just luck." Sumei took a bite of the snow pear and asked, "Have you captured the little princess along the way?" In front of Zhao Man, he was passive all the way, and was taken down by her when Li Tianlan tapped his acupoints and couldn't move. Tang Ning did not answer her, but pointed to a box on the table and said, "I put the eye silkworm goo and the epilepsy goo in it." Thinking of the middle-aged woman, he looked at Sumei and asked, "Do you know a woman named Gong Sun Ying?" Sumei shook her head and said, "I've never heard of it." Tang Ning thought for a while and then asked, "What about Bai Jin?" Sumei put down the spoon she had picked up, looked at him, and asked in surprise, "How do you know this name?" Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 419. Sumei had never heard of Gongsun Ying, but she had obviously heard of Baijin. Tang Ning explained, on the way to Chu State this time, I met a woman who also knew the art of Gu. She repeatedly caused trouble for us. Later, when I caught her, she said her name was Gongsun Ying and asked me if I knew Baijin. Baijin is my master. Sumei put down the spoon, stood up and said, I'll ask her. What's the hurry? Tang Ning sat down on her shoulders and said, it's not too late to ask after eating these. Sumei looked at him, then sat down and continued to drink the pear soup Tang Ning cooked for her. Tang Ning asked, is your master the old woman who often appears here? It's her. Sumei nodded and said while drinking soup, I lost my parents when I was a child. It was my master who picked me up, taught me martial arts, and raised me. When she was talking in her sleep just now, Tang Ning was sitting by the bed. She knew that she was not separated from her parents, but was abandoned. She often dreams about this even now, which shows how much this incident has hurt her. Tang Ning naturally doesn't want to. Hui uncovered her scars, nodded, and didn't ask any more questions. Sumei finished the pear soup and walked out of the room. After a while, the old woman Tang Ning had met before walked in quickly, looked at Tang Ning and asked, you said you have met Gongsun Ying, where is she now? At the Ping'an County Government Office, Tang Ning had already guessed that the middle-aged woman was related to Sumei, so instead of letting Lu Teng take her away, she was directly imprisoned in the county government prison. The old woman took a step forward and said, take me to see her. Xiao Tao said that the old woman once made Sumei kneel down for 3 days and 3 nights. Tang Ning felt angry when she thought about it. She shook her head and said, do you think the county government is a place where you can get in if you want? The old woman showed an angry look on her face and said loudly, you. Sumei came over, pulled his sleeves, and said, you must have a way, just find a way to let us in. Of course, there are many ways to get into the prison, and you can bring people in with an excuse to visit the prison. Tang Ning just couldn't stand this old woman who always had a straight face. But now that Sumei had spoken, he couldn't refuse any more. He stood up and said, follow me. At the door of the prison, 2 jailers saw him coming and immediately bowed and said, Master Tang. Although Zhao County Cheng and his father-in-law often quarrel, they are actually of the same mind. Together, the 2 of them have already turned the entire county government into an iron barrel. Tang Ning often comes to the county government office and is familiar with the government officials here. He waved his hand and said, take them to see the woman who was imprisoned yesterday. Yes, the jailer nodded, stretched out his hand and said, please. The old woman glanced at Sumei and said, you wait outside, I can go alone. Tang Ning's face darkened, she glanced at her and said, if you have anything to say, hurry up. You only have a quarter of an hour. After the old woman walked in, Sumiake looked at Tang Ning, who looked unhappy, and asked, has my master offended you? No. Sumei wondered, then why do you have such a bad attitude towards her? Who asked her to punish you by kneeling for so long? Did Xiao Tao tell you? Sumei was startled and said, sooner or later, this damn girl will have her mouth sewn shut. Although her words were fierce, the corners of her mouth turned up unconsciously when she said these words. Tang Ning shook her head and said, you should also think more about yourself. Sumei looked at him and asked, do you still remember what you said back then? Tang Ning asked in surprise, what are you talking about? Sumei looked into his eyes and said, you said that if it were me, you would treat me the same way you treated Princess Pingyang, is this true? As a human being, you must know how to repay kindness. A drop of kindness should be repaid by a spring. Tang Ning knew who was nice to him. She looked at Sumei, touched her chest, and said, I swear, if this sentence is even remotely false, then let me. Sumei's eyes flashed, she stretched out her fingertips to press his lips, and said, these words are enough. As for what I want to do for you, that's what I like, and you have nothing to do with it. She was willing to pay 10 times 100 times for a hypothetical promise. What kind of experience could make her develop such a character? Tang Ning thought about it and suddenly felt sad. She changed the subject and said, "Who is that Gong Sun Ying? Your master seems to care about her very much." "I don't know." Su Mei shook her head and said, "She has never mentioned it to me." Tang Ning thought for a while, looked at her, and said mysteriously, "Follow me." He walked into the prison, but instead of walking forward, he turned to a room on the left. Su Mei followed him in and saw a wide wall covered with a kind of tubular object. She walked to the wall and asked in surprise, "What is this?" This room was actually a listening room specially designed by Tang Ning. Those things that the prisoner is unwilling to admit in court may be said intentionally or unintentionally without warning. These copper cylinders, connected by copper pipes at the bottom, extend to each cell. In this room, the movements of each cell can be monitored. Tang Ning looked at a guard in the room and asked, "What room is the woman who was detained yesterday?" The officer said, "No 6. Each room had 2 earphones. Tang Ning walked to the wall, attached one ear to the other, and motioned for Su Mei to put the other one on. Su Mei imitated him and put her ear close to the earphone. Tang Ning realized that the 2 earphones were too close. After they put their noses close to each other, the distance between their noses was only an inch. Su Mei saw this thing for the first time. She put her ear close to the earphone and looked at it with interest. Tang Ning blushed a little. She simply closed her eyes and listened carefully to the sound in the earphone. The sound was weakened by the copper tube, but fortunately it was still audible. In a cell somewhere, a jailer opened the door and said to the old woman, "Go in, remember you only have a quarter of an hour." The old woman went in, and after the jailer left, the middle-aged woman sitting on the bed raised her head and looked at her, with a faint smile on her face, and said, "Senior sister, I haven't seen you for more than 10 years, you have aged a lot." The old woman took a deep breath and said slowly, "It's you." "Senior sister." In another room, Tang Ning's face showed surprise. He didn't expect that this middle-aged woman was actually the old woman's junior sister, that is, Su Mei's uncle. He looked at Su Mei opposite and saw that she also showed a surprised expression. Obviously, she had never heard of this uncle. In the cell, the old woman looked at the middle-aged woman and asked, "Where have you been all these years?" "I'm not as capable as my senior sister," the middle-aged woman sneered and said, "He has actually infiltrated the Chen court, and even the envoy who sent the marriage is your apprentice. I heard along the way that your apprentice is trusted by the emperor. When he grows up, great things can be expected." "What do you mean?" The old woman frowned and asked. "You mean the boy surnamed Tang? He is not my apprentice." "Do you think I will believe it?" The middle-aged woman looked at her with disbelief and asked, "He is not your apprentice, will you give him the eye silkworm goo?" "Believe it or not," the old woman glanced at her and said, "the traitor stole the eye silkworm goo and gave it to him. I have already severely punished her." "Just severely punished?" The middle-aged woman looked at her and said, "Eye silkworms are rare, and eye silkworm goo is even more difficult to refine. You regard the eye silkworm goo as your life, but you didn't kill her." The old woman said lightly, "She is born with a charming bone, and her role to me is more important than the eye silkworm goo." "Born with a charming bone," the middle-aged woman frowned, then relaxed her brows and said, "People with a natural charm are indeed suitable for practicing your kung fu. You only need to exert 3 points to be able to fascinate men. It is a good tool. Let's not talk about her." The old woman waved her hand and said, "Let's talk about you. How can you falling to such a situation?" In another room, Tang Ning left the wall with a gloomy face, and pulled Su Mei away, saying, "I don't want to listen anymore." Su Mei rolled her eyes at him and asked, "What's wrong?" The attitudes revealed in the words of the two made him furious. Tang Ning looked at Su Mei and asked, She just treats you as a tool. Why do you stay with her? Is that why you are angry? Sumei was stunned, and the smile between her eyebrows became more intense. She gently pulled his face and said, if it weren't for her, I would have frozen to death and starved to death outside. It doesn't matter if she treats me as a tool. Tang Ning took her hand away, and Sumei reached out and shook his arm, saying, I'm not angry, so don't be angry either. Tang Ning said angrily, nonsense, you are my sister. Sumei looked at him and asked with a smile, since you know I'm your sister, why don't you listen to me? Tang Ning closed his eyes and took a deep breath. A jailer came in and said, Sir, the old woman is out. Tang Ning walked out, and the old woman came out from inside, walked to his side, and said, can you find a way to let her out? Let her out. Tang Ning got angry when he saw this old face, and said angrily, do you think this prison is yours? You can come and go as you please. The old woman reached out and wiped the saliva on her face. She didn't know why he was so angry, and stood there for a while. Please bookmark this site to read the latest novels. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 420. Do you know what crime she committed? Tang Ning pointed at the old woman's nose and said sternly, she colluded with the prairie people to assassinate the princess on the way to see her bride, with the intention of destroying the marriage between Chen and Chu. Everyone in the court was paying close attention to this matter. You asked me to let her go. In fact, few people in the mission had seen Gong Sun Ying's true face, and no one knew the identity of the middle-aged woman he captured. Tang Ning could arrest her whenever she wanted and let her go whenever she wanted. The problem is that he doesn't want to let go. She wanted to assassinate Zhao Man on the way to Chu State, and wanted to harm Li Tianlan on the way there. Now in the capital, she dared to talk nonsense against Sumei in prison, and did these three things that Tang Ning could not bear. She wanted him to let her go and have her big dreams. I didn't kill her on the way, but I was still worried about whether she had anything to do with Sumei, but now I no longer had any worries. Okay, you've seen me too, let's go. Tang Ning waved to the old woman and walked out of the cell. Although the old woman didn't look very good, she still believed Tang Ning's words. When she walked out of the cell, her eyes flashed, and she didn't know what she was thinking. Sumei looked at her and asked, who is Gong Sun Ying? The old woman said calmly, she is your uncle. We have not seen each other for more than 10 years. Sumei asked, why did my uncle collude with the grassland people and destroy the Chen-Chu alliance? These are not questions you should ask. The old woman glanced over her head and said, she must be rescued. Sumei looked at her with an indifferent expression and asked, do you want to rob the prison? The old woman thought for a while and said, go and beg Tang again and see if he can do anything. Sumei rolled her eyes at her and asked, this is a matter of losing his head. Do you think he will listen to me? The old woman frowned and said, he is also a man. Is there a man you can't deal with? Sumei sighed and said, it's not like you don't know that my charm skills have no effect on him. I can deal with everyone else, but I can't deal with him. I want you to try again, the old woman said in a deep voice, no matter what, we must not let her fall into the hands of the Chen kingdom. Sumei shrugged and said, it's up to you. Tang Ning left the county government office and went home directly. He doesn't plan to go to the Ministry of Rights in the near future. Anyway, the court has no arrangements. This trip is not easy. Recuperating at home for 10 days and a half is not excessive at all. Qing'er and the maids in the house were still discussing the gifts he brought from Chu this time. Tang Ning didn't have many friends in the capital, so the things she bought were only things women liked. In addition to giving them to Tianronju, there were also some were given to the girls in Hongxiu Pavilion, some were given to Princess Anyang's mansion, and the rest were all distributed to my own family. He went to sit with Xiru and Xiaoi for a while, then went directly to the room. After leaving the capital for so long, it's time for Tang Renzai's book to be updated. A figure walked in from outside the door, helped him refill the tea, and asked softly, "Master, do you need a slave to rub your shoulders?" From the sound of her voice, she knew it was Shishi. Among the 6 maids who played music, chess, painting, poetry, and wine, Shishi was the most conscientious one. She had been with Xiru for a long time, and even her personality had become similar. Tang Ning was about to write a manuscript when she shook her head and said, "Go and do your work. I will call you if anything happens." Shishi responded and exited, then walked in again and said, "Master, Miss Su is here." As soon as she finished speaking, Su Mei walked into the room. Shishi made another cup of tea for her, and then slowly exited. She used to come and sleep in Tang Ning's room often. She walked to the bedside and sat down, looking at a calligraphy on the wall and said, "Although this wild cursive painting only has 2 characters, the strokes are continuous and natural. There are not many people in the world who can write such crazy writing. Judging from the style, it should be written by the Emperor of Chu, Li Shun. His methods are not easily given away. It seems that you have gained something else from your trip to Chu." Tang Ning discovered very early that Su Mei was actually a talented woman. She was well read, and in terms of sheer knowledge, even Li Tianlan couldn't match her. However, she never showed these things in front of outsiders. In addition to her figure and appearance, others only knew that she was the most beautiful woman in the capital, and they did not know or care about her talents. Tang Ning explained, "I happened to save his life." Su Mei asked, "The majestic Emperor Chu, I only gave you 2 words for saving my life." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "You don't know, that old man is very stingy." Su Mei asked, "Doesn't he have a daughter?" Tang Ning smiled sheepishly and said, "We." Su Mei raised her eyebrows, "You guys." Tang Ning smiled awkwardly, stood up, and changed the subject, "Are you here to plead for that woman?" It was impossible for Tang Ning to let Aunt Gongsun go like this. Along the way, he had tormented her a lot in order to express his resentment. This woman's bewitching skills were mysterious and unpredictable. If he let her go, he would have to sleep in fear every day. Not stable. "Who said I came to plead for her?" Su Mei rolled her eyes at him, put a box on the table, and said, "I gave this epileptic goo to you. It is used for self-defense so that no one will know about it. I feel like it's a poison, but I don't have the eye silkworm goo yet. I'll give it to you when I catch it later." Tang Ning did not refuse and nodded, "Thank you." "Thank you." Su Mei reached out and hit him on the head. Tang Ning rubbed his head, looked at her and asked, "She only regards you as a tool to do things for her, why don't you want to leave there?" Su Mei smiled self-deprecatingly, "If I leave Tianashanju, where else can I go? If you are willing, this is your home." Tang Ning looked at her and said seriously, "You have forgotten that we are a family." Su Mei stared at his eyes for a long time, then burst out laughing, tapped his forehead, and said, "If I lived here, what would others think? The most beautiful woman in the capital was killed by you, Mr. Tang Huaxia. You want to become the enemy of all men in the capital. Don't worry, I'm fine. I'm used to these things, so I don't think it's a big deal anymore. She saved my life, I just did something for her." Su Mei glanced at Tang Ning again, turned around, he waved his hand and said, "I'm leaving." Tang Ning didn't see that the moment she turned around, the most beautiful woman in the capital, who always showed her smile, had ripples in her eyes. Natural residence, in a small courtyard. "There's nothing he can do." The old woman looked at Su Mei, snorted coldly, and said, "He doesn't want to help, right? Don't forget, there is someone living in your backyard. If this news is revealed, he will be. If he deceives the emperor, the Tang family will definitely not give up." I wonder if the emperor will protect him. The smile disappeared from Sumei's face. She looked at her and said, "How dare you?" The old woman looked at her with a cold face and said, "Do you know who you are talking to?" Sumei's face was as cold as ice and she said coldly, "If this matter is leaked, you can take care of it yourself in this natural residence." The old woman's face flashed with murderous intent, and she said in a deep voice, "Are you threatening me?" "That's right." Sumei looked at her and said calmly, "I'm just threatening you." The old woman said in a sinister voice, "Just for one man, what he can do for you, how many people in the capital can do it for you?" Sumei thought of the way those people looked at her and their pure eyes, and said coldly, "Are they worthy?" The old woman stared at her, finally closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and turned away. After so many years of planning, Sumei was extremely important to her and irreplaceable. Without her, her many years of planning would be ruined. "Miss." Xiao Chao ran over crying, hugged her tightly, and sobbed, "Miss, is it worth it for you to do it for him?" Sumei held her shoulders, looking a little dazed, with many scenes emerging in her mind. "Mom, don't leave me, don't leave me. I will be obedient, I won't eat food, I will give it to my brother, I will go look for food, don't leave me, okay?" 15 years ago, in the endless stream of refugees, a little girl in ragged clothes hugged a woman's leg, shouting hoarsely, her vision blurred by tears. "Mayor, don't blame Mom. If I don't leave you, my parents and brother will die." The woman just looked at her, opened her hand, and walked away without even looking back. "Trash, you can't learn such a simple move, what's the use of raising you?" 10 years ago, a middle-aged woman waved her hand impatiently. The girl fell to the ground, got up with difficulty, picked up the long sword on the ground, gritted her teeth and said, "Master, I will work hard to learn Kung Fu, don't leave me behind." The expression on the middle-aged woman's face softened, and she said calmly, "You are naturally charming, and if you practice your charming skills to such a high level, any man will fall at your feet. From today on, you will practice for 2 more hours every day. They say Miss Su is extremely beautiful, and she truly deserves her reputation. If you can listen to Miss Su's song, you will have no regrets in this life. She deserves to be the most beautiful woman in the capital." 5 years ago, Tian was in the middle. The woman looked at the many men around her. Even though she was extremely disgusted with their eyes, she still had a charming smile on her face. Sumei stared ahead blankly, her expression in a daze, until a pair of clear eyes appeared in her mind. "Girl, please respect yourself. Miss Su, can you speak properly? Girl, don't pretend to be so soft in your tone. I'm not used to that." She couldn't help laughing when she thought of their first meeting in Tianashanju, and then they slept together in the Red Sleeve Pavilion. After she woke up, he brought over a bowl of hot white porridge. "I would do the same thing if it were you. Who asked her to punish you by kneeling for so long?" "Nonsense, you are my sister." Fragments kept flashing through her mind, until the last scene that emerged was Tang Ning looking at her in the room with a serious expression and sincere eyes. "This is your home if you want it to be." Xiao Chao raised her head, looked at Sumei, and asked with sobs, "Miss, is it worth it? You are still young and don't understand this." Sumei hugged her tightly and said with a smile, "If he doesn't care about me, he is my medicine. If he cares about me, he is my life." Rong Xiaorong says. "It's the beginning of the month, give Miss Sumei a monthly vote." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 421. After Sumei left, Tang Ning sat alone in the study, sorting out his thoughts. It was obvious that both Sumei's master and the middle-aged woman he had captured from the state of Chu had some big plans. From the fact that she left the second prince and ran away alone, Gong Sun Ying's purpose for doing things for the grassland was not simple, and Tianranju had been operating in Beijing for many years and had close ties with many big figures in Beijing. Its hidden power was beyond imagination. The goal would not be to make Tianrunju the #1 catering brand in the state of Chen. What exactly did this group of people want to do was a question that Tang Ning could not figure out. He did not think about the things he could not figure out for the time being. Since he had already caught her, he would not let her go so easily. It would be a pity to give her a handle. If he directly handed her over to the court, they could do whatever they wanted to do with her. He picked up the pen again, but did not write a manuscript, but began to write a memorial. Someone from the palace came just now and asked him to report in detail what he encountered on this trip. A lot of things happened along the way. The princess was not sent away, the princess was not married back, the grassland people made trouble all the way, and the younger brother of Chu State turned over and became the elder brother. Such a big thing happened. Although it was not the fault of the delegation, there should be an explanation. After writing the memorial, he walked out of the study and saw that the yard was quite lively. Xiao Xiao was practicing martial arts. With the guidance of the old beggar, she made rapid progress. Tang Ning came back this time and found that she was much more cheerful than before. A large part of this was due to Fang Xinyu. Lao Zheng's daughter Nanan stood next to Xiao Xiao and learned in a very realistic way. Nanan is 5 years old this year. During the time when Lao Zheng and he went to Chu State, Xiru and Xiaoi helped take care of her. During this time, Xiaoi taught her to read and write, and the women at home dressed her up beautifully. After 6 months of not seeing her, she was no longer the snotty girl who followed Fang Xinyu around. The butcher's daughter actually looked like a young lady from a young family. The old beggar sat on a chair, watching Xiao Xiao practicing with satisfaction, and then looked at the little girl next to him. He turned his head and asked Zheng the butcher, "Butcher, is this your daughter? How can a rough guy like you give birth to such a pretty girl?" Old Zheng squatted on the ground, took the old beggar's wine pot and drank a sip of wine, and said, "Nanan's mother is beautiful, she takes after her mother." The old beggar looked at him, and it was hard to tell whether the expression on his face was surprise or envy. He curled his lips and said, "Such a beautiful girl, can you be attracted to you?" Old Zheng was indifferent, shook his head, and did not answer. Tang Ning came over, looked at Lao Zheng and asked, "What are your plans for the future? Will you take Nanan back to Lingzhou? Nanan is already 5 years old. When she grows up, she can't kill pigs and sell meat with me." Lao Zheng looked at the small place where he practiced martial arts, wiped the wine on his stubble, and said, "I plan to stay in the capital and let her read some books. Girls should read more books and be well educated, like Miss Zhong, so that they can marry a good family in the future." He stood up, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "If you think it's okay, I will stay here and do some work of killing pigs and sheep on weekdays. You can pay me according to your own will. Let a master like Lao Zheng kill pigs and sheep. Sheep is really a waste of talent." Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "If you want, you can stay here for as long as you want. You don't have to do any work." "That won't work." Old Zheng shook his head and said, "If you don't work and just eat for free here, you don't even have any face left, right?" The old beggar sneered and said, "You still know how to save face." After saying that, he was stunned for a moment, then jumped up, grabbed his collar and asked, "Butcher, what do you mean?" The old beggar and old Zheng had a quarrel. Tang Ning walked to the pavilion where Xiao Ru and Xiao Yi were. Not long after he sat down, he saw Fang Xinyu coming in from outside. She was followed by Zhao Yuan, and a little girl was beside Zhao Yuan. Tang Ning had seen this little girl once. She seemed to be the granddaughter of Prime Minister Wang's family, and was also the sister of the Wang family mentioned by Zhao Yuan. Zhao Yuan ran over and asked, "Sir, did you bring the rouge I asked you to bring?" Tang Ning asked Qing to bring the wooden box over and handed it to Zhao Yuan. He opened it and looked at it, and immediately laughed. He counted the rouge in the wooden box and murmured, "This is for my mother, this is for my sister Wang." The little girl named Wang standing next to him laughed. This is for my sister Zhang, this is for my sister Bai, this. Zhao Yuan was still talking to himself, not noticing that the little girl next to him had pouted. After he finished counting, he took out a box and handed it to the little girl. The little girl folded her arms, turned her head and said, "I don't want it." "Why?" Zhao Yuan was stunned and asked, "Didn't you want it a long time ago?" The little girl pouted and said, "Why do you want to give it to Sister Zhang and Sister Bai?" Zhao Yuan touched his head and said, "Because I promised them." "Humph," the little girl looked at him and said, "You can only choose one from us." "This." Zhao Yuan showed hesitation on his face. The little girl looked at him, stamped her feet, and ran away quickly. "Hey, Sister Wang, don't run, wait for me, be careful not to fall." Zhao Yuan hugged the box and hurriedly chased after him. Zhongyi watched him run away and shook his head and said, "Prince Run is still so young, he only knows how to make girls happy." Su Ru also said with some amusement, "The little girl of the Wang family is angry, let's see how he chooses." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "He is just too young, children make choices, adults." Zhongyi looked at him and asked, "What's wrong, sir?" Su Ru also blinked and looked at him. "Sir." Tang Ning looked away and shook his head, saying, "Sirs won't ask like the little girl from the Wang family. Although adults won't ask like that, they will also encounter the same problems that children encounter." Tang Ning didn't eat much during lunch in the afternoon. He was thinking about how to tell them about Zhao Man and Li Tianlan. At night, he usually wrote in the study. Xiao Yi would accompany him to read books, and Xiao Ru would stand by to help him grind ink or calculate the accounts of the store. Tang Ning didn't write today and was a little absent-minded. After thinking for a long time, he looked at them and said, I have something to tell you." Zhongyi and Su Ru both raised their heads and looked at him. Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "Actually." Zhongyi looked at him and asked, "Actually, the princess likes you, my husband." Tang Ning was stunned, looked at them, and murmured, "You." "We already knew it." Zhongyi looked at him and said, "Because the princess likes you, your husband has to go to Chu and bring her back safely." She looked at Tang Ning again and asked, "Are you on the way?" "No, no," Tang Ning waved his hands and said, "We didn't do anything." There was nothing wrong between him and Zhao Man. Bai, although she had kissed him forcefully before, he didn't even stick out his tongue that time, it was nothing. Zhongyi looked at him and said, "So my husband has accepted the princess." Tang Ning was about to speak, but Zhongyi continued, "Before my husband left, I already knew that the princess liked my husband. She is of noble status, and she has worked harder for my husband than I have. Since my husband has accepted the princess, it means that he has made up his mind. If I object, I would be a jealous woman." She and Su Ru had discussed this matter during the day, and she was very calm at the moment. Xiao Ru and Xiao Yi's reactions to this matter were much calmer and gentler than Tang Ning had imagined. He originally thought that he would have to sleep in the study for at least a month, but he didn't expect them to be so calm. He coughed lightly, looked at them, and said, "Actually, there is one more thing." Zhongyi looked at him and said in surprise, "What else?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Do you still remember Miss Li?" Cool night. Tang Ning sat alone in the yard, cold and hungry. Facts have proved that when people make an inch of progress, they should never think about moving forward a foot. The consequence of taking an inch is that he will be sitting here alone in the middle of the night, starving. The moonlight was bright, and a figure flew over from outside the wall, looked at him, and asked, "What are you doing here?" "Don't worry about it for now." Tang Ning looked at Tang Yao Yao and asked, "Do you have anything to eat?" Tang Yao Yao glanced at him and said, "Wait." She climbed over the wall and flew back a while later, handed him a box of cakes, and asked, "What are you doing here in the middle of the night?" Tang Ning ate a piece of cake and asked, "Aren't you sleeping too?" "I was about to sleep, but I heard some noise here, so I came to see." Tang Yao Yao sat opposite him and said, "What happened?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "We are best friends. Can I trust you?" Tang Yao Yao waved her hand and said, "Stop talking nonsense. Speak quickly." Tang Ning swallowed a piece of cake and said, "This is a long story." Tang Yao Yao said impatiently, "Let's make it short. Some things happened during this trip to Chu." Tang Ning looked at her and briefly told her story. Finally, she said, "That's it? Princess. And Li Tianlan." Tang Yao Yao sat opposite Tang Ning with her back to the moonlight. Tang Ning couldn't see her expression, but could hear that her voice was trembling. At a certain moment, he suddenly felt his hands empty. The cake was taken away by someone. Tang Ning stood up and said, "I'm not full yet." There was a sound of breaking wind in his ears. Tang Yao Yao stood on the wall of the courtyard, looked back at him, and said through gritted teeth, "Why didn't you starve to death?"